Hi guys, welcome to the next episode of our discussion program. But before we go into it, I would really like you guys to check out our Africa course, Know Your Afro Purpose. It is a digital course that deals with all things Africa. So you get to learn about ancient African history as well as modern African history, African culture. You get to discover your Afro purpose and your inherent African nature, and find out about your hidden talents, which we can bring out to the fore in this course. So if you want extended descriptions on what the course is, please check out the links below the video. And in the meantime, enjoy the show. Karibuni. Hello, Karibu, and welcome to the Africa Deep Diving YouTube channel and the premiere of our discussion program, Africa Rising. The purpose of this program is to provide a platform where knowledge of all things Africa can be discussed in the traditional African spirit, where villagers and the community as a whole came together to discuss and dispense with knowledge, and as well as to debate. And walking with me on this journey of discovery and discussion is our fellow villager, Ejidia Kariuki. Ej, welcome, karibu sana.
Asante, I'm glad to be here.
Would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
So my name is Ejidia. As you said, a fellow villager. I like to learn a lot and exchange knowledge with others. In terms of what I studied in school, I studied social anthropology, which then lends to my desire to know a lot about cultures, understand different people and what makes things tick in the world. So that's really where my interest points are, and I'm really glad to be here doing this journey with you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And we'd also like to emphasize that we are not the arbiters of all the knowledge and all the things that we are talking about on this channel. We're doing it in the traditional African spirit, which means sharing knowledge, debating knowledge, discussing knowledge. And so the viewer is encouraged to, give his views and comments below in the comment section. We can learn from each other, which is the traditional African way. So we would really like to emphasize that point. We're not the be-all and end-all of all the knowledge. We just like to spark and start the discussion.
Yeah.
So before we dive deep into this topic, by the way, I haven't even mentioned the topic of the week. The topic of this week of the premiere show is the psychology of racism in Black people. But before we dive deep into this topic, let us consider some of the news items of this past week. We've broken it down into three news items that have happened, and we will do that going forward. We'll try and break it down into about three prominent news items, but where there's very important news, there might be 4 or 5. So this week, we'll start off with topic number 1 is Mali's military junta launching a 3-day national consultation with political parties, unions, and NGOs. Just to remind the viewer, this came about as a result of the coup, what they're terming the military coup in Mali, with the overthrow of IBK, Ibrahim Boubacar Keita. And initially the military had said that they would have a 3-year transition period before they hand it over to civilian rule. But because of the pushback from ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, there's been a lot of dialogue going on as to the length of period of this transition and how long it should be. So at the moment, what they're talking about is having a 500-person forum between ECOWAS, the military, and civilian politicians. And what ECOWAS is calling for is a transition period of 12 months, which is a year.
That's too long.
Which is too long, still. They've already taken the step of closing the borders, and they've banned trade with Mali. And just to give some historical context, this is the 4th coup that Mali is suffering after, let's call it their liberation from French rule, which was in 1960. So these talks are still ongoing between the military, ECOWAS, and the civilian representatives of the politicians. Do you have any views on that?
No, I think this really plays in well with the whole psychology of racism in the perspective of Africans and how colonialism, impacted the way that we are able to govern ourselves. So it will be interesting to see whether within those 12 months, 1, there will be an agreement, and 2, what kind of system do Malians want to set up for themselves? I kind of feel like we we got stuck in thinking about democracy, we got stuck in thinking about the way Europeans taught us to think.
Yeah.
But maybe there's a system that will work better for us in terms of caretaking. Sometimes the military is not a bad thing because it will bring the order and it will bring the fairness, maybe a step back for people to think through what they're going to decide for themselves. But I still worry that we don't take that space and time to rework the systems that were left as legacies as a result of colonialism. So I hope the Malians will do that in this time.
Let's hope. We can only hope and pray. Just to give some historical context for those viewers who are not familiar with Africa and Mali in particular. Mali is a former French colony in West Africa. It is one of the poorest countries in Africa, let alone West Africa, because it has scarce natural resources, because those are the terms in which the imperialist powers have come to have us judge wealth.
Yeah.
It gained its independence in 1960. The president who was overthrown in the coup, IBK, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, was actually a stooge of the French colonial powers.
Yeah.
So they were very upset when he was overthrown because that was their man in position. And like I said before, Mali doesn't have many natural resources, so they are more strategically important in terms of geopolitically.
Yeah.
They don't really have many resources. So let's see how that story plays out. Our second news item of the week is the arrest of the Hotel Rwanda hero. I know I'm going to struggle with this name, Paul Rusesabagina.
Yeah, you've done it well. I can never pronounce that name.
I tried. And yeah, so he was like the star character. I think the film came out in 2004,
Yeah.
Hotel Rwanda.
Yes.
And he was purported to have saved 1,000 Tutsis, I think, in this luxury hotel from the massacre, from the 1994 genocide of the slaughter of Tutsis and moderate Hutus.
Yeah.
And so in the film, he was portrayed as the hero. He was a protagonist. He saved all these lives. But what happened in the preceding years was that he started criticizing President Paul Kagame more and more. Became an outspoken critic of a lot of his political positions. And Human Rights Watch came out this week and called it a, quote, enforced disappearance because Rusesabagina, maybe I just start calling him Paul.
Just call him Paul.
Because this guy, Paul, he had emigrated to Belgium. He's 66 years old and he was snatched from Belgium. So they're saying it was actually a kidnapping, and it's being decried and condemned as further indication of the more authoritarian tactics that Kagame is now employing. So I think he was paraded in front of the national cameras in Rwanda in handcuffs.
Yeah.
The story is very nebulous, very murky. Some people say that he is actually a hero of the genocide that took place in '94. Others say he was one of the main instigators of the genocide. Just for a bit of historical context, this was in 1994. The genocide killed 800,000 people in total, mainly Tutsis and moderate Hutus. It was sparked by the assassination of the president at the time, who was Juvenal Habyarimana. He died also with the president of Burundi, was also in the same place, Cyprien Ntaryamira. And so that sparked the whole thing. Was because Habyarimana was a Hutu, the Hutus blamed the Tutsis. And we will go a bit more into the topic when we discuss the psychology of racism in East Africa. But do you have any thoughts about this whole thing about Hotel Rwanda and its Hollywood superstar?
Again, it's independence, and then we carried on with a system that wasn't working. You had the genocide, and now we have somebody who apparently saved us from the genocide. And so there's a tendency to perpetuate that fear of what happens if Kagame is not in power. But I think it is time for the Rwandese people to begin to think about what next. What's the next level of leadership? Who is their next leader? How will they organize themselves? And to trust themselves a bit more. And I think that those valves are not being allowed. The venting valves are not being allowed, and that's why you have cases where people are being arrested and being demonized, literally. So I think back to, as Africans, how are we writing our own history? The fact that there was a hero at one point, he's won an award, he's a great actor, and just because he's speaking out, we now need to kind of denigrate on his reputation. I'm not sure that this is for the Rwandese people, this is a sustainable way of working. I think there needs to be dialogue. I think there needs to be a reworking again of how we see ourselves as Africans and what works for us. I think the Rwandese are heroes to us as Kenyans because coming from a genocide situation and building their country to what it is now, they're producing mobile phones. They are one of the cleanest countries in the world. I think there's zero tolerance on things like corruption.
Almost zero crime.
Zero crime.
Police on every corner.
These are guys who've got their stuff together. But the idea that they've got it together because they have Kagame in power, I think that's where already things are beginning to rip at the seams.
That's such a brilliant point also, because we have a tendency of kind of this demagogic figures who overstay their welcome and overstate the importance. And I think maybe that balance needs to be found in terms of Rwanda and Kagame.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a developing story. We'll find out what the truth is maybe further down the line, whether this guy actually was genocidal
and what's
maniac.
the role of media of reporting the truth? Because sometimes I think the media is also very manipulated. They're not telling us everything that we need to know in order to make an informed decision.
So it's very hard to tell where the truth lies.
Yeah.
You know, whether he actually was a hero, whether he's hero or villain. Hopefully that will reveal itself over time. But now moving on to the third news item on the agenda, and that is Patrice Lumumba's tooth. It's not as boring as I make it sound. So Patrice,
first of all, I think you need to tell your viewers who Patrice Lumumba was.
Patrice Lumumba was he's one of the most venerated figures in African history, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
He was the first prime minister, I think he was the prime minister, he wasn't actually the president, he was the first prime minister when the prime ministership held much more constitutional power than it tends to today.
Yes.
Of the Congo, which later became known as Zaire. And to cut a long story short, he was taken out by the Secret Service forces of both Belgium and Britain, as well as the CIA. So there were three of them, which shows the threat that they felt that he posed to the people. And what happened was, he was only in power for about 6 months. So he ascended into the office of prime ministership around June or July 1960. By January 1961, he was assassinated, together with two of his political allies. And what happened was, they were tied onto a tree and shot, but his body was later dismembered and dissolved in a vat of acid with the help of Belgian police, or the Belgian Secret Service. And what happened was, allegedly, the story goes that a Belgian policeman took one of his teeth, as a grotesque memento. And so that is the truth now that has been, it was a Belgian court ruling that the tooth should be returned to the family, because one of his daughters, I think her name is Juliana, had written a letter to the Belgian king asking for its return. In Kenyan culture, it's very important for us how our deceased go. And so she said, she quoted it as being, quote, a good step to knowing the truth. The tooth was returned, and it's one of the four very sad. It's very sad.
But it just speaks to who the Belgian regime, you know, chopping off ears and hands, the violence that they perpetrated, and how that, has continued in the cruelty of keeping his tooth. I find that really,
it's morbid, it's macabre. Yes. Yeah. It's morbid, it's macabre, and it's very indicative of this whole...
And now it's a discussion as to whether you should return the tooth or not.
Yeah.
Seriously, in 2020?
Yeah, but I guess that's a bit of a small, good news story.
Well, it's good. I actually did see an article somewhere, and if I find it, I'm going to try and pin that post on the video. There's actually a Congolese guy who went, I think, to France, and he was stealing an artifact that was sitting in a French museum, saying that he wants it back because it actually belonged, I think it was a mask or something. Right. I'll get that article. So there's a lot of this movement of, we want our stuff back. We want our history back. We want to rewrite our history. We want to reclaim our culture.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that going on. And I think like this topic of the psychology of racism is about, how do we own our identity and how do we reclaim it? And then also, position it as a culture of value to the world. Because I think right now, it still being 2020, Africa is this clump of lots of resources, but darkness. The people are neither recognized, and our history is obviously misaligned and miswritten.
Yeah.
So I think this is really an interesting step, that the truth is coming back, but there are also other people demanding that our artifacts.
Yeah, there are many other artifacts that are actually coming back
Yeah.
for demand. So, okay, those are the news items of the week. Guys, feel free to comment in the comment section below on your opinions of what has happened this week in terms of the news. Mali, Hotel Rwanda Hero, and Lumumba's Tooth. Give us your opinions. What do you think is actually happening behind the scenes?
Yeah.
But now on to the topic of discussion, which is the psychology of racism in black people. And because of the breadth and depth of this topic, what we've decided to do is to divide it into a regional analysis of various parts of the continent and the wider world in general. So like we will look at East Africa, we will look at West Africa, we will look at Southern Africa, and we will look at our brothers across the sea in the Caribbean and the Americas, and see what effect either slavery or racism or both had on the psyche, and how it was ossified in terms of our concepts of prejudice, tribalism, racism, bigotry, and those topics. And we'll also briefly touch on our brothers in Northern Africa. We don't want to be accused of being, what's the word for, prejudice against somebody's skin color.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we've divided it into those kind of regional
blocks.
Mm. So it's easier, because what we'll find is, as this topic of discussion develops, the styles of it makes it sound like a fashion show, but the styles
of colonialism, the formats yeah.
of colonialism and suppression were very different in those regions, which is why we've decided to divide it regionally like that. So we'll start with East Africa, and before talking about the manner in which we were colonized in East Africa, we are based in Nairobi, Kenya, by the way, we have to discuss what life was like pre-colonialism. Mm. So, starting with East Africa, and a lot of this, it refers also to the wider sub-Saharan continent in general, where, the way of living. In East Africa and in Africa generally, we had what was called the kinship system, or what academics later termed African communalism.
Yeah.
So it was a system of reciprocal social relations, which were not purely based on blood ties, but were based on the wider community in general, with the family as the base of that social construct, or that societal construct. So that formed the basis of ownership of the factors of production, which were the 3 L's: land, livestock, and labor.
Yeah.
All forms of agricultural produce, so most of it was purely for collective subsistence.
Yeah, there was never sort of like a commercial view of food.
There was no commercial view of food.
It's a very Western concept that somehow you need to commercialize food.
Exactly. There was no concept of land ownership.
Yeah. Just communal resources.
That was anathema. Exactly. There were no real centralized kingdoms either in East Africa. Except for around the lake region of Lake Victoria, where you had certain kingdoms, but it was quite an egalitarian system.
Where the individual was entrenched in the family. The family was the core, and it was the most important, and everything then expanded around that family, as opposed to having a king that then was the center of power and then kind of passed on resources or enabled resources through the society. Yeah. That was not really the case of East Africa. And I think because of that individuality, or the focus first of the family and the community, the way in which then the British, for example, settled in Kenya is very different from the way they would have settled in West Africa. And you found that they had no real conduits of power or delegated authorities. What they actually had to do was set up things like armed forces, or like local guards that were, police that were actually Africans, in order to govern the Africans. They didn't really have like chiefs or kings they could work through.
Exactly.
So their occupation was much more intense. They actually settled. They actually planned a lot of the cities. They planned a lot of the amenities. They created a lot of the infrastructure, because they were here to stay, because they needed to be directly involved in the way power was exercised and dispensed. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So very different.
Yeah. So also what we'll find is that like we said, power was, like there were no like centralized kingdoms, but in terms of like ethnic relations, like inter-ethnic tribal relations, it was very fluid. It's what you would, in today's society, be called social mobility. So there was a lot of trade, inter-ethnic trade between tribes.
Marriage.
There was also a lot of marriage between tribes, which a lot of our African brothers and sisters would look at today and think, all this tribalism, really? Yeah, it actually was. And there was very little warfare between tribes. Whenever it did occur, it was more to do with like diplomatic disputes over territory and stuff, but it was much, much rarer than it was now. And it was seen as a step, it was a last resort. Because
there was always arbitration. There was always discussions that would happen. There was always arbitration. Remember, if you don't actually own the means of production in the way that the European sees, for example, land, then there's nothing really to fight about. The resources are given to you according to how nature is behaving. So if there's a drought and it affects a region across different ethnic groups, they're all suffering.
After that brief summary and recap of conditions, pre-colonial conditions, following on from last week's show, we'll finish off with talking about Frantz Fanon, who was a behavioral scientist, and this whole concept of revolutionary violence.
Yeah.
Now, what Fanon believed was that revolutionary violence was a way of disintoxifying the colonized mind of those that were oppressed. The problem that we find in Africa is that this kind of manifests itself in various forms. Particularly, you tend to find it, especially here in Kenya and in other parts of East Africa, displaying itself as post-election or pre-election violence.
Yeah.
So Fanon talks about the fact that once independence, I know you hate that term, or let's say autonomy, once autonomy has been achieved, how does this kind of colonial violence manifest itself? And he calls it, I think the phrase that Fanon uses is residual brutality. So what happens is that the lines between the oppressed and the oppressor, they are blurred, and this kind of residual brutality is displayed in an on-again, off-again kind of cyclical manner, especially when it comes to very epocally significant moments like elections or the death of a president or coups. So like this violence is always
kind of at the back.
Yeah, it's kind of at the back of our minds. You know, like violence and counter-violence is perpetuated. And Fanon's argument is that this is one of the residual effects of colonialism. Because Fanon was very strong in terms of the fact that he thought that colonialism and the whole conditions of colonialism in terms of societal, social, psychological study were one of the factors that could actually bring on the onset of mental illness. And so for him, it played a very big role.
So it would be interesting to see how that overlays on, if I look at people, and I know we'll discuss this, if I look at people who went to the islands and to the Americas as slaves, they experienced a completely different type of violence than perhaps the Africans did. The Africans, if you look at, for example, like the Mau Mau movement, the violence was because this was an uprising, this was a kind of guerrilla warfare type of situation, and so the British government really felt they needed to go in there with all the violence they could go. But just generally, the violence in terms of being beaten every day, being tortured every day, may not have been as intense perhaps in the East African colonies, versus if you look at the violence that would have happened in the slave plantations, where there needed to be this consistent violence to actually make this person believe they're slaves, lose their self-esteem and accept this kind of slavery. So it would be interesting to see the nuances or the differences in violence. So that if you look at the violence that was done perhaps in East Africa was more in separation of families, was when you committed a crime or when you went against what the colonial powers believed was the right way for you to behave as an African in their midst. But remember, if you look at, for example, in Kenya, there was the rural guys who were mostly experiencing colonialism almost from a distance. And then there was the what I'd call like the city guys, dwellers who were actually impacted much more intensely in terms of their movements, in terms of where they could go, where they could sit, where they could eat, the jobs they could take on. So there was a very different tinge even within those countries. So it would be interesting to see how Fanon, that theory of that violence, that residual violence, plays a part in those different settings. But when I look at, at the end of it, at the end of colonialism, and as Africans, when we have created our own self-determination and liberation, independence are words that are very European in nature. It's like somebody has given you independence. You're a human spirit, you're free. They've just restored you.
Definitely.
I think for me, it's the idea that the system had some mechanisms for violence. There were things like home guards, and therefore the police. A military had to be formed, because how do you hold on to power? The concept of power.
And how do you protect your commercial interests?
And how do you protect your commercial interests? Well, there were these instruments, and these instruments were handed over in the same format by the British or by the colonial powers that be to the people to determine. And so the way in which we have seen violence has come from having those instruments. That somehow the only way to resolve certain conflict is in violence. Whereas in traditional times that wasn't the case. Violence had its place.
In Kenya, they used to call it pacification, a program of pacification, or colloquially, the Wazungus, which are the white people, used to call it hammering.
Yeah, hammering. Yeah, so it's you pacify, and if anybody's kind of raising their head, and then we just took it on, and because we have those instruments, because we invested in them. So that is how we pacify, and that's how we build on that violence going forward in our
East
own
Africa, we'll see how these situations play out in the long term. Especially because there's some very crucial elections coming up. The Tanzanian elections are, I think, this month. In Kenya, we have our elections in 2022. So let's see what happens. So, like in terms of more in-depth regional analysis of certain countries, we look at Rwanda in terms of the style of colonization that happened there. And what happened there was that the Belgians used or chose the Tutsis, or people from the Tutsi tribe, as their quote-unquote collaborators, because they believed that they had certain European features. They were a bit taller, they had thinner noses, European features. So that was a very clever psychological ploy, because whenever the Hutus, which is the other major tribe in Rwanda, looked upon the Tutsis, in essence they were looking at the representation of the white man. And so it was a very, the classic divide and rule, which these imperialists tend to use all the time. Pick a tribe, or pick a group of people, or a section of society who they can use as collaborators. And at the same time engender a feeling of hatred and vitriolic, and create that division. So those fissures within the society were already created by that policy of the Tutsis using the Belgians using the Tutsis as the collaborators.
And I think it's interesting you say they picked people that looked a bit more European, which then speaks again also to the idea of race. And the psychology of Africans who see themselves a bit as evolved, because perhaps they're lighter, or perhaps they look more European. I think there's some sort of residual part of that in us as Africans even now. That these people are more developed in their thinking, they're more European in their thinking, as opposed to African. Sophisticated. So those are still some of the dimensions we use as Africans ourselves. Even after
and also it's
independence.
It was a very clever ploy by the Belgians, because they were playing on very old historical kind of ethnic tensions that existed between the Tutsis and the Hutus, going back hundreds of years. But that's a brilliant point you bring up about the psychology of racism in terms of our perceptions of the white person
being more superior. And anybody who looks a bit like or thinks a bit like Europeans then. So it's an interesting point to note. That then they came in and actually created that division and hatred just based on that. And then of course the scarcity of resources that colonialism always created, where you had some disenfranchised folk over here, and the guys who are collaborating and are favored are enjoying all the resources.
That is such a brilliant point that I hadn't thought about, because one of the factors that we don't really talk about, or is not talked about enough in terms of the whole colonial experiment, is the fact that when these artificial boundaries were erected, which they called borders, they divided communities amongst borderlines. So we have like different tribes in two different countries. Like we have the Maasai in Kenya and Tanzania.
Yes.
We have Luos in Western Kenya and Eastern Uganda.
Yeah.
And what happens is, coupled with that, is the fact that because they introduced this whole economic theory of scarcity of resources, those communities that were divided amongst like those very artificial constructs, which we call borders, had to fight for those scarce, artificially created scarce resources amongst those communities.
And in that fight, then they had to abide, because they either had to pay the tax that the colonial government was asking for, and live by the rules of that colonial government, because what it was saying is, we now control the resources. If you want to access services and these resources, you have to abide by the rules we've set. And that's really still continues today in the form of the governments we have. You have to abide by the rules of the government for you to be rendered any sort of service. And
that really messed us up. Sorry to cut you off, but that really messed us up economically in many ways. Because what happened was, with the use of these collaborators who were mainly the administrative class, and later became the ruling class when we got our autonomy, our liberation, is that because during the colonial period of time, these collaborators didn't have they weren't taking part in any kind of creative enterprises or in means of production. They were merely like intermediaries. They were brokers of power. They were brokers of power. So like the difference between that administrative class or that indigenous bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie in, say, Europe, was that the bourgeoisie in Europe were actually involved in the creative process. Whereas our bourgeoisie
power brokers.
Were just power brokers. So they were not doing anything of economic value except for brokering power for.
And that's the heat that came in the 90s in terms of the genocide that then happened in Rwanda, where you've got people who seem to have been favored by the system for too long.
So what we can actually say is, in Rwanda, the genocide that happened in 1994 was really a consequence of a lot of the colonial decisions that were taken by the Belgians. And so they could not wash their hands off responsibility of that, although they tried their best to do so in '94. So those were the conditions in Rwanda. And we talked about it already in terms of the language, where President Kagame got rid of French and made Swahili the official language, which was a good step of kind of cultural reclamation. Now if we move to Tanzania, interesting country.
Very interesting.
Interesting country, because what happened in Tanzania was that the colonizers used the Asian community as the collaborators. So whereas in Rwanda it was the Tutsis, in Tanzania, it was then called Tanganyika actually, it was the Asians. And the Asians now became the administrative class, and they took over a lot of the means of production in terms of especially business and wholesale business and commercial business. And so what happened was, when Nyerere became president after independence, he had this whole socialist policy called Ujamaa, where he tried to restructure like the kind of social construct that happened during colonial times.
So he tried to level the ground.
He tried to level the playing field.
And the difference, the way we feel it now, is that, for example, the Asians in Tanzania speak local languages. They speak Swahili fluently. They're very much integrated within the culture there. And so that whole Ujamaa process actually helped to level, if you like, the playing ground culturally. I'm not sure that up till date now that the Asians still don't control the economy. I think they still own a lot of the manufacturing, they still own a lot of the economy. But definitely at that time it was trying to stabilize the country in terms of making Tanzanians work as one. I do feel there's a difference. I think Tanzanians are very patriotic. They really kind of come together and take care of their country very differently than, for example, Kenyans do.
Definitely.
So I think the Ujamaa had an impact culturally. I'm not sure economically that it did, because when I look at the means of production, they still very much are in the Asian foreign hands still.
I agree with that 100%, because if you look at the politics in Tanzania, they have very, very little skirmishes in terms of post-election violence or any of that kind of thing, because like you say, the language uniformly throughout the society is Swahili.
Yeah.
The indigenous Asians speak it fluently, whereas
Everybody
our Asian Kenyan brothers and sisters are not maybe as fluent as they are. But
we have taken steps. We've made them the 43rd tribe.
Yeah.
And Asians have had, I think, a kind of love-hate relationship with this country as well.
Yeah.
There's an article I was reading about the violence they suffered during the coup.
Yeah.
Nobody talks about it. Nobody recognized that Asians actually lost their lives. Asian women were raped during those raids. There's really no discussion or catharsis that happened for the Asian community that has also suffered.
Yeah.
But interestingly as well, in the Kenyan context, the Asian community was also in its own right involved a lot in the Mau Mau movement. They actually provided a lot of help to the revolutionaries as well. There are some Asians who actually fought for the freedom of this country.
Yes.
So it's a very patched history in Kenya, but I think in Tanzania there was that concerted effort to level everything and make everybody come together as one and force it. It was a government-driven initiative, whereas in Kenya there was nothing like that. It was each man for himself.
Definitely.
And God for us all.
And the thing is, you've set the stage very well, because what I believe happened, especially in Tanzania, is they managed to achieve a level of social harmony at the expense of economic growth.
Yes.
Because what happened is the system of Ujamaa, for those who don't know, was a socialist policy in terms of economically, socially, culturally, and politically.
Yeah.
Where President Julius Nyerere tried to make it a bottoms-up system instead of a top-down system. So everything was equalized, the means of production were held in government hands. But I think the mistake that Nyerere made was the fact that a lot of the factors of production were still capitalist factors of production. And you see, when the colonizers came and built the infrastructure, and mentioning the Asians again, the Indians who came over from India played a huge role in building the railways. And what happened was that the infrastructure that was built in these countries was built solely for the purpose of transporting raw minerals inland. It wasn't built with any kind of structural integrity which would benefit the indigenous population. So that kind of haphazardness was done deliberately solely for the export of those goods for the colonizers and their economic benefit. So what happened, the mistake that Nyerere made was that he didn't socialize the means of production. He just socialized the society.
So culturally,
culturally he got it right. Economically, he got it wrong. And Tanzania lagged behind. So now if we go to Ethiopia, which is closer to the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia is a very interesting case, because Ethiopia was the only country, one of the very few countries, maybe the only country in Africa that was not colonized. You can include, a lot of people tend to include Liberia in that list, but Liberia will deal with when we talk about West Africa, because that is where the slaves came back. But Ethiopia was the only country that did not fall under colonial influence. And because of that, a lot of people who were involved in the liberation movement in the whole of Africa saw Ethiopia as a beacon of hope and as a symbol of hope. And many people, many historians tend to look at 1935, more so than the end of the Second World War, as kind of the seminal period of when the liberation movements really took hold. Because that 1935 is the year that Mussolini and Italian forces tried to invade Abyssinia, as it was called then, but they fell. And very famously, Haile Selassie went to the United Nations, I think then it was actually called the League of Nations, and gave a very powerful speech, which Bob Marley used as the lyrics in his song War. And so Ethiopia became a symbol of a beacon of hope for many, for not just Africans, but many, many freedom fighters around the world. And
I think one of the things that people underestimate about Ethiopia is that it has a very strong background as a very strong military state. So the emperors that had come before the Meneliks, for example, were very much into development, but also strengthening themselves militarily. Very few countries would challenge Ethiopia even today.
And I think it's important to mention that the lineage of the monarchy in Ethiopia goes back very, very far. I mean, Haile Selassie was claiming ancestorship from King David.
So they've got that, and then what are you going to do in Ethiopia? You can't walk in with the Bible. They had the Coptic church there for hundreds and thousands of years before the missionaries could come in and say, we're going to teach you about God. They already had that. Yeah. So they were very strong militarily and were able to stop any sort of movement. They were very astute negotiators. Even today, Ethiopia has a very strong hold on international money remittances. They are global traders. And I think that's something we don't actually see, or it's not reported in Bloomberg or CNN, so we don't actually think of them as that. But that's who Ethiopians are. They were strong traders, strong military guys. They had very strong negotiation skills. And of course, they had an old religion that didn't need to be missionarized or
bastardized in any considerable way.
Yeah, so they could teach you probably more about God than you could teach them about God, because they had the original scripts. So the Ethiopia was definitely a place where Africa could look up to, because it had all the trappings of development in terms of an African developed state, not necessarily in the European sense. But they had developed themselves very differently, and they then had a lot of strength to keep away any kind of colonial rule.
Yeah, and whereas if we look at our brothers in Somalia, which is right next to Ethiopia, on the Horn of Africa, their society was slightly different, because it was a bit more, it was just as feudal. It was a feudal system, which is why the manifestation of that system is seen today in terms of the warlords that
warlords that are there. Yeah.
But the communities were much more isolated and sparsely populated. There was
independent,
they were more independent. So there was just like pockets of communities that formed, which was a very African trait, especially pre-colonial
in East Africa.
Yeah. As opposed to Ethiopia, which had that whole system of the monarchy and kingship. So, which is why in subsequent years, these imperialist powers found it very easy to divide and conquer Somalia and to destabilize it.
And to destabilize it to date.
And up to this very day, you can see the consequences of those kind of imperialist motives. Somalia is fractured. But unlike Ethiopia also, Somalia, many people don't know this, but has a very rich cultural history. And it was very well known for its poets, what people would call spoken word, and artists. And Somali poets are very accomplished and very well known, especially around that region. So yeah, that's basically like
East Africa in a nutshell.
East Africa in a nutshell, and we can see how the systems of colonialism differed from what we will talk about next, which is West Africa, and how that has manifested itself.
So maybe just to kind of wrap it up is that in East Africa there was more occupational type of colonialism, where the forces would come and settle in the country. The British form of colonialism was also very different from the French and the Portuguese even, in the sense that they actually did invest in things like education, they invested in things like health. They actually believed in putting in an infrastructure, even though it was to extract. It made commercial sense to invest, because then you're going to get Africans who can work for you and sort and do all this stuff for you, as you then ship all this wealth back to wherever it is that it needs to go. So they had a more kind of occupational method than the other colonialists. For example, the French were very much not into building schools or going about and teaching you about God. They were more about, it's a military takeover and it's really extractive. We just want the resources. It was kind of bang and go.
Yeah,
and
brilliant
the British
point.
were very different.
Yeah, brilliant point. Because the French were more, their imperialism was informed along the lines of an army maneuver. It was military men who were in charge of the colonization of.
And the British, it was the merchants, it was the mercantile movement,
yes, the charter system.
The charter system. So for them it was very different, and everything was calculated, it was economic, and therefore the investment could be made because there was going to be an ROI that came from it.
Definitely.
So if you go into these colonies, you'll see very different. For example, I think Kenya has had a huge benefit from the colonial system in terms of the systems we have in place and around education. Even around things like medical, there are still so many hospitals that were created alongside the churches that came, that are very old hospitals that have done some really good work. So sometimes there's that benefit, which obviously doesn't always override the bad things that happened. But it's worth mentioning that this form of colonialism actually had a few assets that could remain behind.
Yes, which is in stark contrast to the French system.
The French system, exactly.
Yeah, and the only thing I would say is that those benefits that were accrued by Kenyan or East African society were residual, they were not deliberate. Because let me just find a quote. There's a very pertinent quote from the high priest of colonialism in East and West Africa, somebody called Frederick Lugard. And what he says is that, this is the quote: "European brains, capital and energy have not been and never will be expended in developing the resources of Africa from motives of pure philanthropy."
No, it wasn't philanthropy at all.
There was no philanthropy at all involved.
Commercial. It was commercial.
Yes, so those benefits were residual as opposed to deliberate.
Yeah.
So there we have it. That's, I was going to say a brief synopsis, not so brief, because it's a very in-depth topic.
It helps us to set the foundation.
It helps us set the foundation, and the viewer can now see what East African colonialism was like. We'll keep emphasizing this point. If anybody else has a contrary view or opinion of colonialism or their benefits, we'd like to hear from you. So put them in the comment section below. Any other information that you guys have would be highly, highly valued and appreciated. Like we say, we're trying to revive that whole African traditional spirit of each one teach one. So we're learning from each other.
And I think also mention that it's important for us to tell these stories ourselves.
Yeah.
I think most of the time we hear other people commenting about how we experienced colonialism, rather than us talking about how we are experiencing it even up to this very day. Exactly. So there's an importance in having this discussion and this exchange, because we are all co-creating in writing our experience of the colonial period and its aftermath. In these years that we are going through.
Brilliantly said. Yeah. So that kind of wraps up East Africa from our discussion, our journey, our journey of discussion with our villager Edge. We would also like to let the viewers know that we have an Afro purpose course, which we're calling Know Your Afro Purpose, which talks about the history, the hidden history of Africa in terms of spiritual history, the cultural history, and how to repurpose yourself as well. For those people who are maybe looking to relocate themselves to the African continent, there's a very big movement amongst Pan-Africanists. So that course will be available very soon. Know Your Afro Purpose. For details on that course, look at the links below the video. So get in touch with that, or get a hold of that if possible. All the information will be below in the rustictalent.com website. Which is the Rustic Talent Agency website. And we are also available on all platforms, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, for further details on the course and on the channel in general. So you can leave your comments and let us know what you think. Asante sana. Edge, anything else you want to add?
No, in case there is something that's kind of burning in terms of what you'd like to learn on the course, make that suggestion for us so that we are able to incorporate it also on the course outline. Yeah. We are here to serve and here to learn together. So.
Well said.
Yeah.
So that wraps it up for this week. Asante sana. Remember, next week we go West Coast, West Africa. Karibu, and thanks for joining us.